Elise Cranny, welcome back to the Running Effect podcast. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be here. I feel like, um, yeah, I've been seeing you put out so many great conversations with people recently and good reflections on the season. So I'm excited to be here. Excited to be talking to you again.
Yeah, your turn. You're next up. We do joke about this with each other like every time we talk, but I truly have lost count of how many times we've talked on the podcast. This has to be like edition 8, 9, or maybe even 10. And before the podcast started, we were chopping it up, catching up on life, and we were talking about like the first time I reached out to you, which was 3.5 years ago. And in our conversations, we always go deep, so we'll just go deep from the gun. 3.5 years ago compared to today, what is one of the biggest ways you feel like you've grown as a human being and athlete over the past 3.5 years?
Wow, we're starting it off with a bang. um, Yeah, I think man, I kind of think the biggest thing I was actually thinking about this as I was like reflecting on this season in particular. I think when I was looking back at some of like the results, like sometimes I feel like or not sometimes, a lot of times they don't tell the whole story, and I think that in the last year, kind of to your question, that is something that I really think about, is just like there are things that I feel like you can't see from like results or from the outside, but I feel like the growth, that I've had over the last 3 years, but especially the last year, has been um, pretty immense. I would say the biggest thing is just doing a better job of really like being confident and trusting myself in terms of figuring out what I need, if that makes sense. I think for a while, especially in, when I was first joining the pro world and in 2021, I think um, I don't think I had the right balance of like learning from people and growing, but also like being able to sit down and identify like what works best for me, what makes me most confident, and like kind of trusting myself, listening to myself. I feel like, it sounds very cliche, but I think for a while I just really kind of didn't listen to that like inner voice or gut feeling or whatever you want to call it, in terms of, again, trusting yourself and listening to what you need. And so I would say kind of that's the biggest growth over the last 3 years, is just kind of being able to identify what works for me, from a training perspective, what works for me from a life perspective, like kind of thinking about, okay, what's the balance I want to have with training in life? Like, how can I, be most happy? I think, moving home last year and being closer to family. And I think, that's different for everyone. Like, but I think for me, figuring out like what fills up my cup from like a mental, emotional, physical, spiritual perspective, and really kind of like creating my, yeah, just like creating my life a bit more, and kind of, figuring out, yeah, what works for me and what makes me most happy, what makes me feel alive, and what makes me the best version of myself, that then, I can bring that to teammates, friends, family, and the people that I'm interacting with. So, yeah, long-winded answer, but I think that's kind of the biggest thing, is just trusting myself and really kind of figuring out, um, yeah, how I want my life to be, and how I want to live it.
At least from the outside looking in, you seem like a person within your career that has made a lot of hard decisions within years, but also even within seasons, changing groups, changing coaches, changing location of where you're living. And this, isn't just strictly about running, other life decisions, as you were mentioning there. Where does that come from? And can you speak to that? Because I think a lot of like listeners out there really struggle to make those hard decisions when something isn't working out, and they just think, I'm going to stick it out. And by the time they have that mindset, it's like 3 years down the road, and they're like, shoot, I'd do anything to get that time back.
Yeah. Yeah, to be honest, I mean, kind of like looking back at your first question, I think that's like very much connected. I think that's an area that I've had a lot of growth in. Like my dad will, say to me a lot, like I think when I was younger and in high school, I would be like, "Oh, I just wish someone would like tell me what to do. I wish someone would make the decision for me." And he was like, "That's not like the fun of life. No one can do that for you." And I think I guess I would say the biggest piece of two things, two pieces of advice that I've gotten that have been really helpful are one, um, is when you're like making decisions or looking to make a change or try something new, is like nothing's permanent. And I think that is something that was really helpful, in just making like just taking away a little bit of the like, gravity of when you're making a change, of just like, okay, you can, um, just seeing it as more of kind of like a process than an end all be all. I think sometimes I can be a very like all or nothing, black or white person. And I think that was really helpful to be like, you can make a change, you can, try a new group, you can, if it's not working or not what you want, you can make a change, you can go back. Like there's no kind of rules around that. And I think that takes a lot of the pressure off. And then I would say the other big thing, that I've come back to a lot over the last year, especially. It's just kind of my own, like, a mantra that I've repeated, but like, is just thinking about, you know, my future self. And I think, I think when you say that of like, okay, you don't want to be like 3 years down the road and be like, I wish I would have, made a decision, or done something different. And I think, for me that's been really big in those hard decisions. One, like really identifying where, when I've wanted to make a change, where that's coming from. And I think a lot of it is usually coming from like really wanting more, like wanting to grow and be challenged. And again, it's kind of cliche, but I feel like when I was thinking about making some big life changes, my sister was really helpful. She sent me a bunch of, I know you're a big quote guy. She sent me a bunch of good quotes about just like getting out of your comfort zone, right? And kind of that idea of like, yes, it's like scary, but I think where I was at in my thought process is like, for me it's worse to stay in my comfort zone than, or like the fear of staying in my comfort zone is worse at this point than the fear of like the unknown or the uncertainty. And so I think that's something that I guess I would like give as advice to other people, is when you kind of feel like you're in that spot, even though the uncertainty is scary and you might have fear of like taking a leap, whatever that um is, yeah, if you kind of have more fear about the status quo and staying where you are, and you just find yourself like wondering or asking questions or like looking around and wanting new things, like really, again, this kind of goes back to the beginning, but like trusting yourself and listening to that, and really figuring out what that means or what that's trying to tell you.
As you were talking there, big quotes guy, I was reminded of this great one in terms of like fear and risk and all that. And it's very simple. I forget if it's from a book or poem or something, but it's just, let me fall if I must fall, the one I am becoming will catch me. And then,
Wow, I
which I
really like
really
that.
love that. Yeah, like your future self almost has you, and even through those tough circumstances, or yeah, the tough periods of life, like who you become in that process, like the future version of yourself has got you. And then when you're talking about, thinking and having that mindset of what would your future self do, what would they want? There was a great saying I came across, I think last week. It's just a very simple question that I think everyone can ask themselves, and through response and thoughtful action, through that response, live an ultimately better life. And the question was, what would me tomorrow want me today to do? And I really
Wow,
love
I
that.
love that. Yeah, one of my big like mantras for the year was make your future self proud. And I think, that can be a statement, but that can also be turned, basically what you're saying, into a question of like, okay, what would, and I think that can be applied to anything, in life, like any decisions or what you're doing. Like, I mean, I thought about that a lot during races, right? It's like, okay, make your future self proud, Elise. Like, how would your future self want you to respond to this hard moment in this race, or respond to the uncertainty or taking a risk or fear or whatever it is. And I think another piece, this is a little bit of a small tangent, but I think about when you're making decisions or changes, like something that's been helpful for me too is just trying to look at everything as um just being like, what can I take away from each experience? And I think that's been helpful. I think in times in the past, I've got really kind of like stuck in the past or caught up on if I felt like I've made mistakes or had regrets. But I think in the last couple of years, I've really tried to work on that that piece where it's like if you make a decision and let's say it's not what you thought, or you then want to make a different decision, like not having any regret about it, but being like, what did I learn from this experience? Like this needed to happen. And I think having that mindset is really helpful, right? Like every step or change or learning experience or challenge or setback, like I think it just, when you can find the meaning in it and find what it was supposed to teach you, then it's like there's no like right or wrong decision. There's no wasted time, so to speak. It's like you're learning something, and each, little piece of whatever it is that decision is, is doing something for you and helping you move forward, even if it may not feel like that in the moment.
Going off of something you were talking about earlier, the conversation you'd have with your dad in high school, as well as the aspect of like making your future self proud and having that kind of conversation and dialogue with your future self about what they would want you to do in that present moment. And this might be a long rambling question, but the question is simple, and then I want to add some substance after it. Question is, why do you think as humans we are so bad about listening to our own advice? And I've personally experienced this with you because in high school I had like setbacks and injuries and weird sicknesses, and you were amazing through that time period. But a lot of times it took someone like you or a family member or someone else to be like, to look at the situation and tell me what to do. And even though it is the advice I would give a friend, and having that framework, like people always say, what would you tell a friend, and then do that. For whatever
Yeah.
reason, I could never like actually accept or adopt it myself. And an example for a runner out there who everyone can relate to this is like a friend says on an easy run, my Achilles hurts. And you say, take 3 days off. It won't affect your fitness. But next week, your Achilles starts hurting. And what do? You double down and you still do the workout and you still do the mileage, and you probably might even do more because you feel like you have to prove something. So circling back to that question, why as humans do you think we are so bad at listening to our own advice?
Oh man, I wish I had like a off the top of my head great answer for that question, because I honestly, that question sometimes drives me crazy. And I think we've talked about this a little bit, but like I know my dad in the past has been like, Elise, you're not listening, like he's trying to help. And it's like, I am listening and I hear you, but I think sometimes it's so hard to like internalize that. And I think along those same lines, like I've felt that same way. I mean, just even as you said, like having conversations with you, or like I know, Vanessa and I have had a lot of conversations, or even as I've done a lot of mentoring through voice and sport. And it's like, it seems so like obvious, like you're saying, like take 3 days off, or like you don't need to do more, or you don't need to run faster, you don't need to compare it to others, like particularly, in the realm of like running and training. But it can be so hard to take your own advice and do that yourself. And I think, I don't know, um I think we just get in our own way sometimes, a lot of times. And I think I think, I don't know, I guess, yeah, I don't really have a good answer to this question. I guess the biggest thing would be, um, I think as humans, just like needing to show more grace to ourselves, I would say. I think we're really good at, being like kind and compassionate to like friends and other people that we want to help. And I think oftentimes, at least speaking for myself, I think that's where the advice comes from, right? It comes from a place of like love and compassion and like wanting the best for someone else, which seems silly because I sit here and it's like, well, I do want the best for myself too. Like everyone should want the best for themselves. But I think, at least for me, I think that's something that I'm trying to work on, is just like showing that same like grace and compassion to yourself. And so I think, I don't really know. I'm not exactly answering, but I would say I think that's probably where it comes from. Maybe it's different for other people, but I know for me, I think trying to be a little bit more kind to myself, where it's like you're not making an excuse if you're taking 3 days off, you're just being smart. But I think sometimes that also goes along with just, any goal we have. Um, I think when it's a personal goal, we can become so attached to it, rather that whether that's in, running or business or school or just something in life. I think sometimes it's so easy to like lose that like long-term perspective and want to like grip a goal so tightly. And I think, that just like narrows our vision. So I think it feels way harder to to take our own advice when it almost feels like you're so in it. So I think, that's another piece too, I guess, if if I were to give any sort of advice, is just like trying to like, loosen the grip on the goal and be like, okay, I think we've talked about this before a little bit, but like I remember Coach Milt told me that in college, right? It's like make your
Shout out.
goal and then set, yeah, shout out Coach Milt. Like, create your big goal that you want, but then put it up on the shelf and don't like grip it so tightly. And I think that's just tied into being able to like listen to that advice or like really make the right decision of like, instead of just plowing ahead at all costs because you think that's going to get you to the goal, is really thinking about, okay, what would you tell a friend? And you would tell them that because that would be, even though it sometimes feels paradoxical, right? That would be the way you're telling them that, because that's the way that you believe, they're going to be able to achieve their goals and get to the highest level and reach their potential. And I think, yeah, it's so hard, but just like working on that, on applying that to yourself.
Going off of that some more, how much do you feel like comparison plays into these subjects, in the sense that a lot of times I think what blinds us is we think, what will X person think of me if I make X decision? So for a high schooler, it might be, what will my coach think if I tell him I have to take 3 days off because my Achilles hurts? Or for someone like you on a larger scale, I know you're good about not really caring what the outside world thinks of you too much, but naturally as human beings, I'm sure those thoughts pop up of like, if I change training groups, what's the outside world going to say about me? And a lot of times we let those thoughts of what someone else will say about us actually prohibit us from taking the action we need to.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, again, I think that kind of goes back to your first question, and that's like a great question because it's like something that I think a lot of people struggle with and something that I've struggled with. Like I said, I think that's why I lost track for a while of like, I think I would be like when someone was like, like again, my dad would be like, what works for you, Elise? Like, and I would be like, no, I have no idea. And he's like, you've been doing this for 10 plus years. Like, yes, you do. But I think kind of that panic of being like, no, I don't, would come from a lot, like putting too much um, on caring about what other people think, if that makes sense. And then I think you lose your inner voice and you lose what you actually want to do because you're getting so hung up in, what other people have to say. And I think that's actually something that like Jared was really helpful when I started working with him in March of this year and he started coaching me. That was something that was so helpful and he kept coming back to. And like, I would encourage, people listening to this podcast, if you're having trouble, like listening to that inner voice, or find that you're, kind of caring too much about what the outside world thinks, is like sitting down. And Jared had me do this exercise where, you're literally writing down, like you make a circle and it's like, who is at your table? Like, who are the most important people at your table? And the people that are going to like love you, care for you, no matter what decision, no matter what you do with your life, like what path you take. And I think that's so helpful because I think when you have a visual of that and you have that, like you literally write it out, with your people around a table. That's just like, he was so good at reminding me throughout the season when things would come up of like, okay, if someone says something, it's like, is that person at your table? It's like, no, like then you don't waste energy on that. Because I do think it's important. Like I do think being humans, right? Like part of it is important that we listen to some people's outside opinions, like people that we trust and value, because I think that can be a hard thing. I think for a while I was like, I don't know how to find that balance because I want to like learn and grow and be challenged and held accountable. And I want people to call me out and I want someone to be like, hey, this is a bad decision or not a bad decision, but like, maybe this isn't the best decision to make this move or to do this. Like, where is this coming from? And I think, when you think about the people at your table that know you really well, I think they have a good idea of like, okay, where is this thought process coming from? Where is this decision coming from? So I think that would be my biggest piece of advice, is like figure out, the handful, and it shouldn't be too many, like 5 to 10 people that are at your table. And those are the people, just keep coming back to that. Those are the people who maybe you ask them for advice and you take it, more into consideration because they know you well. And then reminding yourself like not to waste energy on, you know, people that maybe don't know the full story or aren't there at your table.
I love Coach Cornfield, and I'm not surprised he came up with an amazing exercise like that. I think that's so good for listeners to put into practice. There's another one that I love. That's not a practice, but just a statement, and I think it's accredited to Christian Bale, the best Batman in my opinion. And he said, "If you have a problem with me, call me, and if you don't have my number, you shouldn't have a problem with me."
Oh my gosh, I like that. That's great. That's
I think
insane.
it's so good. It's like if you don't have my number, like you probably shouldn't have a problem with me.
Yeah.
And if you have a problem with me, let me know. Like call me. So
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. It's really hard, I feel like. It's just in our human nature. But
well,
it's so
also
hard.
people love projecting their lives, but what I found is people love projecting what they didn't do onto you. And there's a
Uh-huh.
saying, and I think you and I both have, really good friends who don't have this kind of mindset, but people want to see you do good. They just don't want to see you do better than them. And
Yeah.
so even for me, like something like not going to college, like I think triggered a lot of people by just not going to college. And it's because it challenged the status quo of like what's normal. And a lot of
Right.
people don't want to see you do better than them, as sad as it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. Which I think, that's where I love the table analogy because it's like it's not very many people and it's like you have to think hard of like who are the people again that like love you unconditionally and like truly want the best for you in every aspect and part of your life. And I think that's just like so important because then it's like there's no ulterior motives. You're like, if this person's giving me advice or telling me something, like I know it's coming from a place of love. And I think, again, I think that's so important too because it's like I've had this. It's like it's hard to like call people out or hold them accountable, but it's like I want people to do that for me, but it's like it has to, Jared and I have talked a lot about this, like it has to come from that place of like unconditional love and respect where you have that like trust and foundation where you know that when the person is saying, oh, you could do better here, or maybe you should think about this, is like, it's coming from a good place. And so you want to take that advice versus shutting down because that it's like, this person wants the best for me and they see that these are areas that I can grow in versus someone just being critical for the sake of being critical.
Right, right. There, I'm totally gonna butcher this, but there's a great passage in Scripture. I think it's in Corinthians where it talks about love and how if you have love, you have nothing. And it talks about like you can have all these gifts, but if you don't come from a place of love, I think the verbiage they use is like you're a resounding gong, and like no one will actually, even if what you're saying is true, if you don't come from a place of love, you'll just be noise to the person. And I
Yeah.
think that's so good. Yeah, if even for the people that are close in your life who you love, if you don't come from a place of love, even if what you're saying is true, generally as human beings we're just going to shut it out. Like
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
don't want to hear it.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think, again, not to keep circling back to your first question, but like thinking about growth too, I think that's something that I've learned um, a lot the last couple of years from my dad too. Like he's really, really good at this. Like I think he really helps people get the most out of themselves because he's like willing. He calls it in his mind. He calls it straight talk. He's like, people are too afraid to like tell people how it is or say how it is, but it's like he's so good at like being honest and upfront. But it's the most important thing is that he's coming from a place of love and compassion, and like the people, like that he works with or his friends or my mom or me or my sisters, it's like it always, that it's coming from a good place. And I think that's something that I'm really trying to work on too, is how can you really be like honest and want honesty from the people in your life, knowing that it's all coming from like that place of like love and compassion.
You mentioned, I guess you'd call him Jared. Where I'm always in a weird situation when I have coaches on because it's like I would maybe call Jared to his face, but I wouldn't call him Jared on the podcast just because I try to keep it professional. So I'd call him Coach Cornfield, but then you call him Jared. So I have the Jared pass today. So Jared, you mentioned having that conversation with Jared and the table analogy. I know these subjects we're talking about right now are right up his alley, and I'm sure you talk about these sorts of things with him all the time. And I think it's good leeway just to talk about that introduction to him being your coach and what that has been like this year, the impact he's had on you as an athlete, and that collaborative relationship. So, talk about Jared
Yeah.
and what it's been like working with him this past year.
Yeah. Oh man, it's hard to put into words. Kind of how I said at the beginning when it's like sometimes like growth in like mindset or approach to the sport isn't always necessarily like seen in like results. And I feel like there's just been I just feel like he's totally transformed um, my approach to the sport, and I just will be forever grateful for that. Which is kind of crazy. We were talking about just the other day, like I just started working with him in March. So it's funny. We're really looking forward to like fall training in like 2025, just because it felt like um it felt like he's helped me so much and we've made so much progress, but we were like, wow, we really only had like less than 4 months of a season together. And I feel like it was definitely a bit like up and down and chaotic, just like in March, and the trials are coming, and I ended up getting a stress reaction in May. So it was just like everything felt like a bit like, I think we did a really, really good job, but just like a bit kind of like rushed, so to speak. And I think he did an amazing job even through that, though, of like having these conversations kind of and touching on these topics that we're talking about, which I think is so important. Like, I think it would have been really easy to be like, it's March, we just need to jump into training. But, right when I started working with him, I went up to Flag for a couple days and we sat in a coffee shop for several hours. Like, that's where he came, he was telling about the table analogy, but it was just, he had so many great questions that really made me stop and think, of just a lot of things that you touch on the podcast, of just like, what's, we came up with a mission statement. Like, he's like, I want you to write a mission statement for the year that has nothing to do with outcome. And he was like, how are we going to define success? Like, why are you doing this? And I think things that you can like, I feel like I had thought on and off, but not really like written down and reflected with someone on. And I think that was just so helpful then, in terms of like going into every race, but also like processing each race and taking away, um, pieces of like what I learned from that race, but also being able to, I just feel like I was able to process races way better. And I think, um, I think I see this in like a lot of young athletes, and I was this way myself, where it's like if you don't reach your goal or it's not what you wanted, it's like this huge, just like, you know, feeling like you need to like reinvent the wheel, or you're just like so distraught. Like, I just remember that when I was younger, just thinking like every race was the end all be all. And if it wasn't like perfect or I didn't reach my goal, it was this huge failure. And I think, um, he's been so good at that again, of like the mission statement and the like, how do we define success, and the approach being so much more focused on the process and not the outcome. And so it's like that's always within our control. And I'll always be so grateful for that. And even thinking about just like, it's kind of wild, I think. This is also kind of like a cliche. Now I'm totally rambling, but a cliche of like, right, it's like about the small moments and not as much the big ones. But I truly feel like when I look at my Olympic experience in Paris, it was like something that really stands out to me is, after the 5K final, it was like, it was super late. I don't know, 10:30 or 11, and I had finished cooling down. And it's like Jared and I walked around the warm up track for probably like 45 minutes. But it was just so helpful. It was just like he brought me back to like, okay, like neither of us were like stoked on the like overall place or outcome, but it was so much like more healthy to process that race with him, and that we had this foundation of like how we define success and how we want to go about racing, that's regardless of outcome. That I think it was just, yeah, it just was such a something that will stick with me forever, of like, okay, we took a lot of steps forward and we learned a lot, and maybe that's not shown in the outcome, but like just there's so much more to running than just the outcome. And he's so good at that, right? Like, it's just and I like there are so many. I've been so grateful to have so many incredible coaches like that, where it's like it's not just about running and athletics, but it's also about becoming the best version of yourself as like a person and a sister or a brother and a friend and a teammate. And I think that's something that's also been really cool about working with Jared, is just like I genuinely feel like he's invested in making me a better person too.
I know in our conversations throughout the past few years, it seems like within, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, within many of those seasons, you had periods of burnout or injury or just honestly struggling with, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, like loving this sport. Where do you stand today? What's your perspective on the sport? And how do you feel like having someone like Jared, who's so aligned with your values as a person outside the sport, has helped with having a more sustainable outlook on how running fits into your life and not just running?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally changed it. Like I've said, I think I finished um the 2023 season and was just like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. And I think a lot of that, most of that definitely came from me. It's like that wasn't coming from anything external. That was just coming from the pressure I was putting on myself. And again, kind of, um, I heard this great analogy the other day of like, it's like having this like beautiful colored smoke in front of you and you're just trying to like grasp it, and the more you grasp it the further away it gets, instead of just like enjoying it and watching it. And I think that's definitely what I was doing. Like I think I just got in the mindset of just like you want it so bad. And I think that's something that, um again, we kind of touched on this. It's like very similar themes and it's so paradoxical, but I think that's what Jared has, really brought me back to. It's just like you have to loosen the grip. Like it the actually the more sometimes that you want it, the more that you get yourself into that overtraining and that burnout. And um it yeah, it's just counterproductive and counterintuitive. And so I think, the approach this year was just, which something that he's really helped me with too, which has helped with the burnout, is just like, trying to work on like the perfectionism piece. And it's not any one workout or one day. It's stringing together and getting that consistency, but also the word that you use that I come back to a lot is just like making it, sustainable too, like from a mental, like from a physical perspective, but also from a mental and emotional perspective. And I think my family and my close friends that are in Colorado have helped with that a lot too, just kind of getting that more, feeling like a more whole person. And I think, um, yeah, I think we've talked about this before. And I was definitely this way as like a quote person, and being like just where you take kind of that advice at face value of like what society says or what the sporting world says of, right, just like the harder you work, like less sleep, like the more you plow ahead, the more you want it. And it's like there are parts of that that are good in terms of like, yes, like sport and running and anything you do requires, sacrifice, hard work, and dedication. um but I just think for a lot of time in my early career, I took that to the extreme. And unfortunately, that again, it becomes counterproductive, right? I tip the scale the other way in terms of thinking that like you have to be just like so locked in and miserable. And it's like you realize that like when you're when you're a happier person and when you're excited about chasing your goals, but you don't kind of have this fear of like what happens if I don't get it, or I'm going to feel like a complete failure and I'm going to feel worthless if I don't get there. That you're able to have so much more joy with it along the way. And I think you're able to um, soak in the moments of like growth, and you're able to try new things. I think that's been something that's really fun with Jared, is just like experimenting a little bit with training, or being like, oh, do we feel better when we do these type of workouts or this type of workouts? And I think when I was so focused on a goal before, I was like, I don't want to make changes, like I don't want to, like this is the way, there's one way. And I think just having a little bit more flexibility in that is like very like it's really stimulating like mentally. And I think it's also good to change it up for, from a physical perspective too, and give your body like a different stimulus. But again, just like makes it more fun And like, yeah, again, not to sound cliche, but I think that's it, it really is important. Like, you have to be happy and enjoying it for it to be, I think you can get away with doing that for a little bit, but for it to be sustainable over the long term, you got to find some joy in it.
I absolutely love the smoke analogy, and it reminded me of a quote that I may have shared with you in the past. I'm not sure if I have, but I don't think I've ever said it on the podcast before. The quote is, "If my hands are fully occupied in holding on to something, I can neither give nor receive." And I think when
That's
we
really
hold on
good.
to things, yeah, we can't give or receive. And it's just not a fun way to live when we're like super uptight about one specific thing happening and addicted to the possibility of a potential outcome. And I'm curious to get your thought on how important, and you did speak to this in your response a minute ago, so elaborating on the thought some more. Like, for a listener out there, how important to actually flourish in the sport of running do you think it is to be loose and free within your running? And of course, set those goals, work hard towards them, care about your running. Like, it makes sense to care about your running. It's a part of who you are and what you do. But also, like, being loose and free is probably how you're going to enjoy it the most. And by enjoying it the most, probably be as successful as you can be.
For sure. I mean, I also think when you're like loose and enjoying it, like your mind also, right? Like the mind and the body are so connected. And that's what I've like realized too. I'm like, my, not only am I enjoying it more, but my body also feels way better and can actually run way faster when I'm doing it from a place of like freedom and joy than when it's just like the minute, like, I mean, I think people have probably done this exercise before, right? Where you like sit and you talk about things in a certain way and it's like you can feel it in your body. Like I've felt that where it's like when you're approaching it from like a I've got to, like fear-based, anxiety driven, like you feel that tension in your body, right? And that panic in a workout, and it's like everything gets so tight. And I think so, from like on a micro level, I think just having like, freedom and joy, and a word that Jared and I have used a ton this year that's part of my like mission statement is like be curious and curiosity. And I think again that leaves so much like more room for like that joy and freedom, because there's not like something, there's this like curiosity, there's not like an outcome with that. It's just like be curious, you're exploring, this is like a fun thing. It gets back to, that's another thing that I thought a lot about, is just like that, like I really like this, um like my sister loves the word wonder, and I come back to that a lot, just like again, that like childlike wonder and just being like so excited. And I think that's where it's fun, like anytime I get to spend time with like younger runners or people getting into running for the first time, and it's like they're so excited about it. And I think that's what I would say is like, especially for like high schoolers or college athletes, it's just like it's so easy to get so caught up in the splits and the goals and the times and the outcomes. And um I've talked a lot with Christina Aragon about this too, of just like, you, even if you like if you do that for a little bit and you accomplish your goals, it's just, unfortunately, it's like it's not worth it. You get there and you reach your goals and you're like, was it worth it to be, again, this is an exaggerate, miserable is an exaggerate, but like miserable, or
Sometimes.
yeah, kind of like you're saying, like even just like, so structured that I like wasn't able to interact with my teammates. I wasn't able to be the best version of myself. And, um, that's a piece that I really come back to, is like, even like getting away from like an outcome or running well. But I feel like I've gone through periods of time where when I have gripped it so tightly and I'm so focused on running, I'm like, I am being the worst version of myself. And for me, that is really upsetting, because I feel like running has changed my life and opened my world, and is where I like learned when I first got into it to be the best version of myself, to be confident, to be alive, to like connect with people, to be out there running and see new places and meet people that I would have never otherwise met. And so I think that's something that I try to remind myself and come back to too, that I would encourage other people to do, is just like, is your approach helping you grow and challenging you and making you the best version of yourself, or is it keeping you, kind of stifled and in like a box or in a very rigid area? And yeah, I actually, I just was talking to my dad about this two days ago, because he's like, Elise, like, what can we do? He was just like, I don't understand, and I think he's seen it firsthand with me, but just thinking about, when middle schoolers or high schoolers or people are first getting into running, and it's like, it's so much fun, and like you're getting so much confidence from it, and you're challenging yourself and you're getting better. And we were just having a conversation, and it was a very eye-opening for him to ask this question. He's like, how does it seem to go from that to so many people having so much fear and anxiety and eating disorders and depression and isolating themselves, whatever it is. And yeah, I think that part is, now I'm getting kind of down a rabbit hole, and I'm and I'm rambling, but I think that part is still like really upsetting to me, because I fell into that trap. But I'm like, this sport is such a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing, and it's something that, like, you can do right from your door, and you just need a pair of running shoes, and it brings people together, and the community is incredible, and there's just so much that the sport teaches you that can be applied to any area of life or relationships. It really is such an incredible teacher, and I think it's just sad that, yeah, when you kind of start to have so much fear or anxiety or focus on the outcome, that like those good parts and the powerful parts can become so lost.
Such good stuff. Oh my gosh. I can't wait to re-listen to this one. Take some notes in the process of
It's
really
like you
listening
ask
to
me
it.
one question and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm just thinking of all these things and going on like a huge
It's amazing
monologue.
though. A lot of good insights in there, a lot of good nuggets of wisdom, as it always tends to be when you hop on the podcast. Um, you don't have to spill the tea here if you don't want to. And I know you are also someone who embodies the saying, be where your feet are. And I know Coach Milt really preached that in your time at Stanford, and that's one of his favorite sayings. So maybe you even haven't even thought this far, but I would assume you have. Something that really intrigues me with you, Elise, as a person, is you are so like deep and philosophical and well thought through that you have thoughts that most runners don't have. And with that, in my analysis of that, in our conversations with each other, you definitely seem like someone who like could walk away from the sport with a lot of untapped potential. Or I could also see you running for 12 more years and winning an Olympic medal. That also wouldn't shock me. How do you view your future in the sport of running? And what do you feel like you have to accomplish or do or go through before hanging up the spikes in a way in which you're happy leaving behind the sport?
Wow, that's a really good question. Yeah, um I think the biggest thing is kind of like I said, I think just feeling like I'm turning over a little bit of a new leaf with that consistency and sustainability. So I think the first thing that, I've thought of, um, and I think, this was actually super inspiring watching um, Jess Hull this year. I feel like, she had huge breakthroughs. And I think, in some of her interviews or just talking to her, people were like, what changed. And I think a big thing that she said was just getting consistency. She's like, I've been healthy for, over like a year and a half straight or something. And that just had me thinking of, I was like, wow, since I graduated high school in 2014, so the last 10 years, I haven't had a full consistent year with no interruptions. And I think that's something that, um, before I were to walk away from the sport, like mostly just for myself, is something that I really, really want to do. I want to, kind of like we talked about at the beginning, where you're better taking your own advice and you're making decisions from a place of like confidence and being smart, with that being the primary goal. Um, yeah, because I think that's just something I'm just like, I don't want to have interruptions. Yeah, it's kind of hard, like I said, like trying to loosen the grip on the outcome goal. But even watching, um I feel like in Paris, just the men's distance runners, they did so well. geez, just like I can't even start naming because it's just so many, but it's just like Cole and Yard and Grant and Kenneth Rooks, and just I think seeing the like, I feel like it's always kind of been there, and the sprints and the jumps and the throws the last several years of just the US being a powerhouse, but really seeing the like men come on to the like international stage and get medals this year, I think that's something that's really inspiring. And so I think a big goal that I'd like to accomplish before I'm done with my career is getting a medal on the global stage, and also hopefully just being a small part of the wave of women's distance running in general, and just being up there in every event from the 800 up to the 10K, where we're competing for medals. And I think another thing that was really helpful is Vanessa Frazier, PT that she's worked with since high school, that I've gotten to know over the years. His name is Jeff Moreno. He's great. I met up with him the other day, and he was said something really helpful of like, again, kind of like we talked about earlier. I think it's just so easy when you're in it to look at something from such a narrow perspective. And he just had such a fresh perspective of like, instead of looking at it as just like, oh, there's another worlds next year or what's in 2026, he was like, look at it as like, this is the start of like a new quad between now and LA. And he was like, we were talking about just like getting consistency. And I was thinking about that today. It was just like, wow, like what would, if I even had a year of consistency in the last 10 years, like what would 1 year of consistency look like, but then 4 years of consistency. And so I think that's something that I really am thinking about for the next 4 years, is just kind of having that like, um, again, I guess that curiosity and that approach to be like, whoa, what could this look like? Kind of like we were talking about before the podcast. I feel like you just have such a good vision of like what could be possible for you in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years with the podcast. And I think, yeah, I mean, this doesn't encapsulate it, and this sounds silly, and it's such a simple saying, but like really like dream big. Like I think what I want to do the rest of my career is, have it be consistent and sustainable, and not put limits on myself. And I think the last piece too is just approaching it from a spot where I feel more happy and balanced. And I think wanting to hopefully allow that to inspire other people of like, you can accomplish your biggest dreams and goals while still being the best version of yourself, like we talked about, not being like miserable and so just like not able to live your life at all. And I think, Christina and I have talked a lot about that, is like the running world doesn't need another example, right? Of like super rigid, like being so, you know, like too hyper focused on, what you're eating, or getting, caught up in that. And as as someone who has been there, I think it's like even wanting to prove, we've talked about your future self, but wanting to even like prove to my younger self, like it's not about the like rigidity and wanting it more and forcing it and overtraining and like working so hard to the point that just like totally destroy your body and mind. And so I think that's a big piece in terms of like my approach the next little bit.
Even though we haven't really explicitly talked about 2024 season too much, I think you would agree that all of these principles probably played into different aspects of the season. So just a brief question on the season before we start to wrap up here. Such a good conversation. I can't believe I didn't really explicitly mention 2024, but I wasn't going to ruin the flow of the discussion. How would you sum up 2024, the season itself, and your mindset and perspective on it through reflection over the past few weeks removed from the season? And how do you feel like that's informing decisions you're making going into 2025?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Also, last goal, really quick, to your first question,
Go for it.
is I really, really would like to break 2 minutes in the 8 before my career is done. That's just something that has always been something that I wanted to do since high school. And even Jared, and like when I was working with Jerry, and even with Joe when I was a team boss, I feel like we were like, Elise, like you're not an 800 runner. Like it just doesn't really matter. But that's just something for me that is exciting and brings me a lot of joy. And like, yes, does it have a lot of meaning in terms of like the events that I actually do? No, but that is something that's important to me. So had to get that out there. Have to put it out into the world, manifest it, so
I love it.
everyone can stay very what's the word, in
On
tune
their
with the
toes.
sub two
Yeah.
journey.
Sub two
uh,
attempts. We'll have a celebration pod to break it down when it happens.
yeah, I would also like to try a marathon at 1.2, but okay, looping back to 2024 season. um, yeah, I think it was, upon a lot of reflection, um, I think the first thing that I think of too is, and we might have talked about this a little bit, but this is something that I would definitely, even want to instill to younger athletes is, there's a difference between like excuses, but also like taking things into consideration and considering context. And I think I've always been so um averse to like wanting to like make an excuse for anything that I think sometimes I don't fully take into context, like growth or things that are happening. And so I think, thinking about the 2024 season, I think there was so much change. And I think, I had a lot higher expectations for myself. And I think, it's been helpful to think through like, okay, that's not using it as an excuse, but there was a lot of change and there was a lot of there are a lot of different things that I just feel like I was working through and trying to get that joy back and running. But I think, some of the biggest takeaways were, um again, that there's just, I think for me, that there's not one way to do things, but it's about finding what works best for you. And I think for a while that was, when I first left Bowerman, that was really hard too, because I like loved working with Jerry. I loved the training there. I loved his training philosophy. I loved the team. And I ran really well. It's like that thing where there wasn't anything wrong. I just needed a change. And I think because of that, it took me a long time um, to really work through that you can do things a different way. Like I said, because it wasn't like anything was wrong. I was running well. But I think that's kind of the biggest thing that I look back on the 2024 season is just like there are a lot of different ways to get to the same point. And I think that's what's really cool about the sport too, right? Is like for each individual that looks different, like the exact nuances of training look different, but also the training setup, whether you want to train in a group, whether you want to train in um on your own, whether you want to train at altitude or at sea level. Like I think just kind of honing in on what works for me has been really big in 2024. And again, I think also a big takeaway is trusting that you don't need the build up to be perfect to still accomplish your goals. And I think that's a really big thing that I've learned over the last several years, but something that would probably be one of my biggest pieces of advice to younger athletes is just like no one's preparation is perfect, and it's really about how you like handle those setbacks. Like I said, it's like it's not ideal to make a coaching change in March. And I said, like, I think it was like 3 weeks before, 2.5 or 3 weeks before I ran at pre, I had a stress reaction in my femur. And I think that was really good about working with Jared too, of just like taking it day by day. And I think that's what we did a really good job with this season. And something that I want to take into 2025 is like, um, just like taking it day by day, not getting too high or too low emotionally, but really trying to like string things together, take things as they come and say, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what kind of setback I'll have, but like I know that I'll handle it, and I know that, we'll get through it. And I think that was like a really good lesson in 2024. Just so much change, a different race schedule, different, even doing like switching up the events at USA's and doing the 5K and the 15, but like getting out of my comfort zone and, being a little bit more like bold, courageous, and curious. And I think that's what I really want to bring into 2025 is just, not racing or training from a place of fear, but really being smart and really being excited to like try different events, put myself in different race scenarios. Yeah, I kind of think, now I'm rambling again, but my last thing is, I think, the 1500 running the 1500 at the trials, I think is kind of the epitome for me of the 2024 season, in terms of what Jared and I talked about, of just like being excited to like challenge yourself and try something new. And I feel like those 3 rounds are kind of like a very good picture of how we're approaching 2025 too, of just like there are a lot of different ways to train. There are a lot of different ways to race. And like the first round, I think it was like super slow, and then I took the lead with 400 to go, and then the second round I took the lead from the beginning, and in the final it was fast from the beginning, so I just tried to hang on. So it was really cool to me that it was like the same distance 3 different times, but just completely different races raced in completely different ways, and being like really curious about that, and just wanting to, yeah, just be a bit more like fluid, and kind of like I said earlier, like not every race is the end all be all, but every race is like a stepping stone and an opportunity to like learn something new or try something new. So not being afraid of that, but being excited to embrace that, and just have like a little bit of a different approach this season, maybe race some different distances or race some meets that I haven't done in the past. And I think that's part of just like keeping that like excitement and freedom and joy in running alive. But yeah, sorry again for the long answer.
All good, all good. Always good stuff. So I do not mind whatsoever. Reflecting on this conversation itself, there's a quote that I think perfectly sums up a lot of the subjects we've talked about. And funny enough, I sent it to you in February, and I want to read it and get your thoughts on it as we start to wrap this conversation up. The quote is, "I spent so much of my life terrified of what I was going to become and whether I was going to be right here, right now. Gosh, how much time did I waste afraid I wasn't going to be right here, right now? If I could change, the only thing I'd change about my whole life would be fearing less that I wouldn't get right here, the place I was going anyway. I wouldn't change all the mistakes and mishaps. I needed those. But all the constant worry that I wasn't going to make it, that took me out of the moment, that took me out of enjoying these experiences, smiling, eating my lunch, or whatever I was doing. Know your mission. Have faith you're going to get there. Wherever you go, it's going to be all right. Just find ways to get out of your head."
I love that. I like remember when you sent that to me, and it's still like so good. I mean, I think that's what we've taught, like everything that we've talked about in this conversation, right? It's just like really being present, like getting out of your head, and like enjoying those like little moments, and doing the best you can. And like I feel like I don't know. It's just, I think I've said this on a previous podcast with you, but it's something that I think about a lot, is like take what you do seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. And I think it's like, yeah, like, even with that, it's like take it seriously, and you care about it. And it's like, that's really cool that, when you're chasing a goal, like that's what's so special about it, is like you're invested and you care about it because it's something that you're passionate about. But again, being clear, like what you just read in that quote, and that's something that Jared has helped me come back to, is like really being like super clear on your mission and your why, and having that really inform your day-to-day decisions and your ability to like live in the moment and find joy, instead of being so hooked on the outcome. And like I said, I think that's something that I would do at the end of every season. I'd be so excited to set my goals for next season, but I wouldn't quite have that kind of mission statement or that underlying foundation that I feel like I found, that Jared really encouraged me to do. And that's something now that's so nice, that it's like that's your big overarching mission statement, is your goal, and you can have those outcome goals below and the process goals, but that like having that mission statement is something that allows me to like stay present and be where my feet are, as you say, of like on a in a race, in a workout, on a daily basis.
Elise, I could talk to you for another couple hours, so we'll save it for another podcast because they are numerous. And excited for those conversations whenever they happen. Final question for you, though. Ending today's conversation on a lighter note, what are some things that have brought you joy outside of the sport of running? And as we are, at least in Columbus at the moment, fully in the swing of fall, what is Elise Cranny's like fall mood board, like movie, TV show, music,
Ooh.
favorite fall drink, all that sort of stuff. Spill the tea on fall.
Ooh, such a good question. Okay, I think the biggest thing is just getting more time with my family. Also, one of my sisters passed the bar and started her job at a law firm in Chicago today. And then my other sister became a third grade teacher just like 6 weeks ago. So visiting her classroom and like seeing them both just like absolutely crush it has been amazing. My best friend since elementary school had a baby in December, and I feel like people have asked me recently, they're like, is that, they like are starting to think that like it's my kid, and I, because it's all over, she's all over my Instagram, sweet Maya. She is not my baby. I'm her I'm her not her biological aunt, but her auntie, but she brings me so much joy. I think, as we talked about earlier, like childlike wonder. I just feel like I love being around babies and kids, just like seeing them like discover the world for the first time. It's so refreshing. Yeah, I think um, I've done a few trips in the off season. Got to celebrate. Emily Pritt and Ryan Hill are getting married in December, so she was out here, did her little bachelorette party in Boulder. So just getting time with friends. I also did a couple day trip to Mexico with Courtney, Christina, Shelby, and Carissa. And so I feel like just being, and I went to a college teammate's wedding. So I feel like reconnecting with um, old friends and newer friends, but people that I just haven't really seen in a while. Especially, I think, in the running world, it's so special to get to see, my friends like in like room with Carissa and like on the racing circuit, but then to be able to spend some quality time outside of the running world is always nice too. Um, and yeah, I think just being able to be in Colorado this fall. I had just moved back last year, so I feel like I was a bit preoccupied and a little bit stressed and trying to move and figure out what's going on. So I'm excited to be settled this year and just be able to enjoy the Colorado sunshine and the leaves changing and like those crisp fall mornings that like just you have like incredible, runs. So yeah, just simple things like that.
I love it. What's the you go to a coffee shop? What's the go to order? Do you like pumpkin drinks or no?
Ooh, I'm slowly getting into coffee. I'm like usually kind of only into it like in Europe. I'm not like an everyday coffee person.
You're telling me you want to pay
Um
like $10 for coffee in Switzerland, but won't have it in the States? Okay.
exactly. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, how do people pay for coffee every single day?" But then I'm like, "Yeah, I was paying way too much in St. Moritz for coffee." My sisters have got me really into and my grandma, she's really into like an iced matcha latte. I haven't had a pumpkin
That's
spice
tea
latte
though,
yet.
not coffee.
Yeah, that's true. That's not coffee. My go-to order is like people make fun of me because it's not really coffee. I'll get like a decaf like vanilla latte. So it's like I don't even know if you can
Okay,
really
pass
call
on
it.
this question.
Okay, wait, I actually have a good answer. I have a good answer. Okay, Courtney, when we were in Mexico, she was getting sweet cream cold brew, and I had never had cold brew, and then I just had it the other day, and it was really good. So yes, but I'll probably have a pumpkin spice. You got to have like a pumpkin spice latte like once in the fall, and I really like pumpkin pancakes and pumpkin type things. So I'll probably go get a pumpkin coffee. I totally just botched that whole question. Just forget it.
No,
But
that the Courtney answer was valid. That is actually valid coffee.
you were like, I shouldn't have asked this question. You are not answering it.
No, I'm just like a coffee enthusiast, and that hurt my soul a little bit
Okay,
until the actual response.
what's your go-to order?
Generally, vanilla latte. It changes iced or hot depending on location and time of year and heat,
Okay.
or if you run before, because a lot of times you run before you want something cold. But if you run when it's really cold out, sometimes you want something hot. But I generally stick to vanilla latte, just because if you go to a new coffee location, you can then properly compare it. Whether if you get a new drink every time, you can't compare a coffee shop in Arkansas to one in Texas versus
That's
Ohio versus
true.
California. So, and with all the travel, my one go-to is like I will always go to a local coffee shop, and I'll try to get a
Wow.
recommendation
Okay,
from a friend there. So,
off the top of your head, like just not even thinking like what place in all your travel have you had the best one?
Oh, easy, easy. I'm a Merit coffee enthusiast in Austin,
Wow.
Texas. Yes,
Oh
they
my
love me.
gosh.
I love them. So my podcast with Gabby Thomas, when we did it in person, legitimately the first 10 minutes of the podcast was talking about Merit coffee. And I met her for the first time before I even reached out to her to come on the podcast. I ran into her at Merit Coffee and I didn't even know she lived in Austin. So
Wow. Wait, I
yeah.
love
I think I told this
that.
story in the podcast, but I got my drink and I went to turn around and a dog was in my way. So I stopped and I looked up and it was Gabby. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know you lived here. Um,
Wow, that's
so
wild.
yeah. And then I'll like, anytime I'm like in Austin, I'll always put it up on my story or whatnot. And last time I went there, one of the baristas follows me, listens to the podcast. He gave me the friends and family discount. So
Wow, you've made it.
go support Merit. Merit, and then it's actually world famous. I think it's been ranked in the top 10 coffee shops in America the past couple years. I think it's like Onyx in Bentonville, Arkansas, Fayetteville,
Oh,
and Bentonville. And they have like world famous beans. Very good coffee there as well. But anyways, all these notes aside, ladies and gentlemen, that is a hour masterclass on running and flourishing within it with Elise Cranny. Elise, always appreciate our conversations. You are truly the best and so wise and deep in thought, and I know it impacts the listener. So thank you for the hour of wisdom that you just gave. Really appreciate it, as always.
well, thank you for having me back on. As I said, I think before the podcast started, I appreciate all your questions, and I feel like it helps me to really think and reflect and forces me to be open and honest. So thank you for giving us this platform and allowing people to share wisdom. It's definitely something that I wish I had when I was younger. Just listening to a podcast like yours, where you can learn a lot and hopefully avoid some of the mistakes that people older than you make. So thank you for having me on.